The introduction went, my name is Ricky Eckhart. I am the Industrial IT Cybersecurity Manager for ExxonMobil. This is a fairly new organization. We're about 24 months old. Our purpose is to leverage all the cyber-relevant data that we harvest from within an ICS environment and around the perimeter of the ICS environment to enhance our cyber investigations specific to these industrial facilities. So at ExxonMobil, we have facilities that range from unconventional upstream out in the West Texas area, conventional upstream facilities like LNG, deep water, those types. Our midstream facilities, which would include our pipeline, loop operations and blending facilities, our fuels terminals, and then all of our refineries and chemical plants. So the entire spectrum from an oil and gas perspective. So the focus here is going to be on our journey around protecting the perimeter of all those industrial assets. So I always start off these presentations with a theme of balance. So you hear in these conferences, just like ARC, a lot of discussion around digital transformation. I personally don't like that term. I think it's all about the creation of business value, whether that's through digital tools or other services and capabilities that we can deploy to generate business value. It's incumbent upon us to generate that business value because that's why we're in the oil and gas industry, is to generate shareholder return, to generate profits. We have to balance that out from a cybersecurity perspective. We need to enable the business value generation, but in a very cyber secure way. If we tip the balance all towards business value, then we can compromise the acquisition and sustainment of that value if we don't have the right cybersecurity posture. Conversely, if we only focus on cyber, then we're not going to capture the value that's best for the corporation. So just maintain this theme of balance as we go through my presentation. The other item I wanted to touch on before I get into the specific area around the cyber perspective is another theme that you hear at these conferences is IT-OT convergence. I like to think about it as IT-OT collaboration. We have some very distinct functions within ExxonMobil: operations, engineering, and IT. And we simplify that for the purposes of these conferences, but we need to respect each of these functional groups' strengths and capabilities and collaborate together to deliver solutions and services that can enhance the posture of cybersecurity for our industrial assets. Each of these functions has a critical role to play. Operations is the owner of the risk. They develop the business requirements that we need to focus on. Our engineering group, they have the engineering standards in that ICS cyber and safety lens of some of the consequences associated with industrial cybersecurity events. And then our IT department has a lot of knowledge around enterprise type technology and scalable cybersecurity capabilities. When you bring these functions together and align on common objectives and a mission, great things can happen for the corporation. I have many examples where we're not there yet in my company, but what I'm going to talk about today is a great example of these organizations coming together, aligning on common objectives, and a great outcome was achieved. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay. So the challenge that I want to highlight in my presentation is really about this theme of remote access. So there was a good panel discussion yesterday. BASF, Dow, Shell, ExxonMobil was on there, and they were talking about remote access, but from the lens of many, many different use cases. My focus is really going to be around three dimensions: stranded data, remote access of third parties needing persistent access into an ICS environment, and how that led to our need to evolve our perimeter detection capabilities. So I was just chatting with someone earlier, and from a stranded data perspective, again, you hear a lot about digital transformation, unleashing that data. There's multiple ways that you can do that. We saw a very high proliferation of wireless sensors coming into our facilities that we needed to secure the connectivity around. Very important from a business value perspective to unleash that data, get it out of the ICS, but we needed to focus in on how do we do that securely and sustainably. The next item that really spiked during COVID was third-party remote access into our ICS environments. So especially within our upstream facilities where they could be very remote, and historically we would fly people in, OEMs, suppliers, third parties, et cetera. We couldn't do that anymore. We had to come up with a way to enable that third-party access without bringing them into the facility to introduce risk to our very critical operators. Also, there was a significant business value generation because now we're not flying people in on helicopters to deep water assets. So these were the use cases that really started to formalize our approach to enhancing the perimeter detection capabilities around the ICS. So our architecture, this was simplified by my legal department a few times. So this is what we get to share with you. So I'll talk through it and hopefully provide the appropriate level of context. So our architecture was really focused on, again, enabling visibility around the perimeter. And there's two primary dimensions that I'll highlight today. Number one is something that we're all very familiar with, the level 3, level 4 firewall, the network control point that separates the enterprise environment from an ICS environment. The other dimension, which I'm going to focus more on, is what we call external network connections. And this is any external network connection coming in from the internet to an ICS environment. And again, that could be persistent third-party access. It could be to flow data out of an ICS environment to a third party, but it's external to the ICS coming in from the outside world, so an untrusted connection. So the focus was, how do we enable the appropriate level of visibility, specifically, again, around these external network connections? Historically, what our sites would do is they would leverage standalone firewalls that they would purchase, they would configure, they would deploy. Now we have no visibility into that firewall. We don't know the integrity of that firewall configuration. We don't know if the firewall is accidentally bypassed in case there was some troubleshooting taking place. So we said we want to have centrally managed and monitored firewalls for these very critical external network connections, because southbound of that firewall is our high consequence ICS environment, whether that's a SCADA system, a DCS, a PLC, could be some flow meters that we just need to connect into to send data to another third party. But we need to make sure that the integrity and the resiliency of those network control points are continuously managed and monitored. So the fleet of firewalls that we began to deploy for this specific use case are now centrally managed and monitored by my organization. The other item that we wanted to enable was to take advantage of some of the features of next-gen firewalls. So IDS, IPS capabilities. So we get more visibility on detection and even blocking certain traffic on the firewall. Because again, high consequence events are resident southbound of the firewall. So we want to take advantage of those enhanced features of these next-gen firewalls. The other item is getting very granular in how we instrument the rules and the policies on these firewalls. So from a next-gen firewall perspective, we can get all the way into layer 7 policies. So it's not just IP and port. We can actually focus in on the application layer and restrict that traffic to absolutely the minimum that needs to traverse the firewall to facilitate the business use case. So we wanted to go very deep from a security perspective, and going back to that chart with the collaboration bubbles, leveraging some of our network security experts on the IT side to really help our engineering and our operations partners make sure that these firewalls were protecting the critical assets that they were intended to protect. And the final item, and this which is what dictated the technology vendor that we chose for this endeavor, we needed the firewalls to have OT protocol awareness. So a lot of these connections depend on Modbus over TCP type connectivity. So we needed the firewall vendor to have OT protocol awareness. When we started this journey, there weren't a lot of those vendors out there. It's improved quite a bit since then. But at the beginning, we were very focused on what are the business requirements set out to us by the operations group? What are the engineering standards we need to comply with from an ICS and safety perspective? And what are the IT technology capabilities that we can bring to bear to solve this problem for the business? And that facilitated us identifying the right technology vendor to partner with and us being able to deploy these across the world. So protecting the perimeter of the ICS. Why are we doing this? Obviously, we want to improve our detection capabilities around that perimeter. We want to increase the number of endpoints that we're monitoring because that feeds into our cyber investigations. We can look for anomalous detection on the firewall that are internet facing and have, again, a very critical ICS component on the south side of it. So with the deployment of these capabilities, we did improve our visibility. We can start to enhance our detection capabilities around the perimeter, which feeds into more insightful investigations from an ICS perspective. So the final reason that we did this, again, going back to my balance chart, we're doing this to enable business value. Cybersecurity should not be perceived as a barrier, but in my opinion, as an enabler of business value and a sustainment mechanism for business value. Our business needed more third-party connectivity. They needed to send data to third parties. We had to come together with the operations, engineering, and IT function to facilitate the best solution to solve that problem to drive business value for the company. At the end of the day, our business is in the identification, acquisition, refinement, and distribution of various hydrocarbon products. So we need to enable our business to function in the most secure, reliable, and sustainable way. So from this lens, we were able to achieve that by improving the capabilities of perimeter detection and enabling our business to take advantage of all these new use cases. So that's all I have. Very happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I know that some of you, thank you. Some of you have probably heard me speak several times already this week, and I apologize for that. I'll try and be good this time. So my name is Clint Walker. I'm with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I will say that, my wife says I have one of the shortest attention spans known to man. And with that being the case, I don't remember which stories I've said this week already and which ones I haven't. So if I repeat a story, just pretend that I'm your father telling you that good old story from the good old days, that 1500th time. So let's talk about threat landscapes. I'm going to take a little different shift on this. I'm going to run almost what's going to be considered a tabletop exercise here for you. This is kind of a scaled down version of what we do with our partners. And it's going to kind of walk you through, and I'm not going to have time for you to answer the questions, but think to yourself, am I prepared for this? What would I do in this scenario? How would I look at things differently? Because, and for those of you who don't know, we are the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They make me do this for every slide deck. I apologize. We are here for the nation's risk managers. We take care of the .gov domain. Everybody's heard this, right? I can just skip over it. All right, let's move on. Whoops. How many of you have seen this chart before, the threat landscape? When I first started in this industry, the threat landscape wasn't quite that big. It was insider threat, which was mostly around, embezzlement. It was extreme weather, because that's always been an issue, whether it be, it's extreme weather, but I always put, natural disasters in there, whether it be earthquakes, mudslides, fires, it's all lumped into there. And then there was accidents or technical failures, what we call our network cowboys, people that didn't want to follow the rules kind of things, or just drunk drivers hitting that power pole at 2 a.m. That's what we had to worry about. And then 9/11 happened. And suddenly, for the first time in our history, we were the target of terrorist attacks. And that put a whole different spin on things. I mean, we'd always kind of worried about terrorism I come from the intelligence community, and we were always worried about terrorism, but mostly to our international plants or our international embassies and things like that. And then came pandemics. I worked for the Department of Health and Human Services for many years, and we always had a pandemic action plan. How many of you before COVID hit had a pandemic action plan? Anybody? Wow. That was one of the things when I used to do auditing, and as I go through and do assessments for organizations, one of the things I always notice is that organizations tend to put all of their IT people in one cubicle farm in one part of the building all together. And I always say, don't you see this as a problem? What if one person gets sick? And they're like, oh, when flu season hit, one guy gets sick, and then everybody in the office is sick, and then we're running on a skeleton crew. I was like, and it's never occurred to you to do something about that? Maybe split the groups, have different teams, find a way to make it where they can work so they're not spreading germs and disease to each other. Because I like working for the CDC, we had all kinds of things that didn't need to get out of the labs, and we had plans for everything that could happen. But now after COVID, I see that a lot of organizations have that. How many of you struggled or had to move quickly to find a way to keep operational while your workforce was going to be put at home? Did you have anybody trying to come to you and say, hey, I don't want to come into the office because I'm concerned about my own health and safety, or I have a loved one at home that I can't put at risk because they're, a high-risk individual? And maybe they were the people that had the keys to the kingdom, or they had all that knowledge you couldn't stand to be without them. Did you have a plan for that? But then that last category comes in, cyber attacks. Cyber attacks, to me, is not really a risk landscape. It is a subcomponent of every other risk landscape out there, because cyber is part of everything. It's not a separate track. It's involved in everything that we do. It's insider threat, cyber being used as an insider threat. It's cyber being used as terrorism, extreme weather taking out your cyber capabilities. It's accidents or technical failures impacting your cyber. And then it's the pandemic making you evolve your architecture or the way that you operate. Cyber is an element of risk in everything that we do. And that's the mindset that you have to take, is you can't think of cyber as a separate component anymore. It's not an office that runs by itself. It's a component of everything that you do. It's involved in everything that your organization makes up. This is what you're really protecting yourself against this day and age. You have your ransomwares. They're still out there. We still deal with this a lot. A lot of people think that malware has gone away, but ransomware is the number one out there. Malware is still out there too. And there's actually a lot of malware. It's just the news doesn't report on that like they do the ransomware. And then advanced persistent threat. Is everybody familiar with the term advanced persistent threat? Yeah. That's where the bad guys get into your network, and they don't steal anything initially. They just want to live in your network. They want to live in your network until it's advantageous for them to take action. They want to become part of your baseline. They want you to not notice them. Guess when the prime time for an advanced persistent threat to get in your network is? When you're being attacked by somebody else. Because what do you do immediately following a cyber event? You re-baseline, right? You say, what do we look like? And if the bad guy got in while the other bad guy was doing their damage, then they're now part of your baseline, and you're never going to find them. Or it's going to be very difficult for you to find them because you've made them part of your home. That's what the APTs do. They kick you when you're down. They look at you when you're dealing with something. You're looking over here, they're coming in over here. How many of your, incident responders would click on an email during a time of crisis that said, here's more information about what's going on, or we're going out of band for this, so please click here. We see it all the time with threat actors trying to get in. Once it's gone public that you're being hit with something, you better believe that there's going to be 15 other threat actors coming at you at the same time, because they want what the other guys already have. And then threat to external dependencies. How many people do you trust in your organization? One of our assessments that we do is called the external dependency management, where we look at what exactly do you depend on for an organization. We look at who are your vendors and suppliers. Just if you were to take out a piece of paper right now and write down every single vendor and supplier that you had for just your IT and OT systems, you could probably fill that whole page up, right? Now, would you bet your job that all those places are secure? That you can trust every bit of information coming from them? That's what you're asking your information security team to do. How are you vetting your third parties? And then look at infrastructure providers. And then look at, public services, fire department, police department, FBI, DHS. How are you building relationships with those entities? But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm not going to stay on this slide for too long. Most of you have already seen this. The bad guys come at you from a vertical. They get in from the outside. They move horizontally through your network, lateral movement, left and right, credential harvesting. The event that I was dealing with yesterday is we're doing victim notification for this organization. We're telling them, hey, we saw that your organization, that some of your accounts were being sold on the dark web. And they're saying, hey, we don't have any way to figure out, we couldn't, from what the FBI had, they could only give them the first part of the username or the account name, just what they were able to see on the dark web. And they're like, we have, 50 users that all have that same beginning string. How am I supposed to narrow it down? How do you track, or how would you do forensics on 50 individuals trying to figure out which one with their accounts got compromised? Meanwhile, this particular company operates across the globe, and they have to do, they have over 6,300 employees. How would you reset 6,300 passwords? Could you do it in a stage enough where the bad guys couldn't stay one step ahead of you and keep changing things after you just changed them, or creating new accounts? Because that's what the bad guys are doing. We talked about island hopping a little yesterday. Remember, you have vendors, you have suppliers, you have infrastructure providers, and they all have different avenues into your organization. They're all going to be using either direct connections, emails, or some other form of communication. They might be coming on site or have badge access to certain parts of your facility. How do you monitor or to ensure that they're, doing things the way that you want them done? How do you know that they're taking security as seriously as you are, or as you would like to do? I always find it funny. I like to tell stories, so I'll tell you this one little story. We went to this organization, and the organization, we were walking around and we're doing kind of an assessment with them, and we were saying, how are you really looking at your logs? And they're like, well, every day we seem to have a problem, especially on the third floor, which is where the cafeteria is located. And the problem is that every day about 11:30, the network goes really wonkers. And that's a technical term, by the way. And for about 2 hours, it stays that way. And we can't figure out what's going on. It seems to just keep doing this. And so we went with them, we did a little bit of investigation, and we finally, found out what the problem was. The problem was there was a custodial engineer who had access to the comms closet, because that's where he stored his brooms and mops and stuff like that. And the cafeteria ladies had given him a little bit of lip one day. And so he decided to take it back at them by unplugging their router so that they had to take all credit cards manually every day through their lunch rush. That was his way of getting back at them. But that took down the entire third floor, which was the engineering floor for this particular company. And it was happening every day, and it took them months to figure out what was going on. And that was just one small thing. So not every event has to be the bad guy. It's not a nation state coming after you. Sometimes it's your own employees that are doing these things. And that's what I ask you to take a look at, is think with an open mind. How do you start an investigation? Are you immediately assuming that it's somebody from the outside? Or could it be somebody, whether it be a vendor, supplier, contractor, could it be somebody on the inside? Somebody you have no oversight over? Could they be one of the problems? This is just our normal slide here where we tell you, hey, smaller organizations are being hit just as hard as a large organization. So if you're a middle or a smaller company, you need to be just as wary as the big guys, because they're using you. Because the one thing that you have probably that the bad guys need is a US-based IP address. Because a lot of companies do geolocation blocking, and so they need a US-based IP address in order to initiate their attack. So they want to make you part of their botnets, if nothing else. All right, let's talk about incident management for just a few minutes. I don't want to go over my time here, but how many of you say you have a good incident management program? I get a lot of shaky hands. So incident management, a lot of times when we go on site to an organization, we ask them about their incident management program. They immediately show us their incident response plan, and we tell them that's only one part of your incident management program. Incident management is 3 separate teams. It's your incident responders, your business continuity, and disaster recovery teams. It's how do you respond to the incidents, quarantining when necessary, how do you keep business operating, and how are you recovering or planning to recover if it becomes a disaster. If you have one person trying to do all 3 of these things, or even 2 of these things, then you're not acting efficiently. And we find most organizations is when we read their incident response plan, it's got these 5 people listed. We go to their business continuity plan, those same 5 people are listed. Go to their disaster recovery plans, the same 5 people listed. Like, well, which one takes precedent? Is responding to the incident more important than keeping the business up and running? Well, no, keeping the business up and running. Well, then who's responding to the incident? And all the fingers just kind of point at those same 5 people. People can't be in 2 places at once. You really need to look at that. And then you need to look at things in a little more detail. Are you talking about an enterprise response plan? Are you responding from the CEO level down? Are you responding because of a site? Is it just one site that's impacted? Is it a system or a business process that's impacted? Or is it a specific event? Most organizations only build an enterprise plan. They're not looking at a site plan, although in this particular arena, I'm sure you have site plans and maybe not an enterprise plan, or maybe you have both. But people very rarely look at something as a business process or a system line. That's how we look at things from the federal government, is we don't care about a certain site. We don't really look at the enterprise as a whole. We want to look at a specific service line. It might be your accounts payable service, everything from how a customer would pay online till it gets all the way to the very end of that track, or how you distribute electricity or energy. So from the time you generate it all the way up to the final point, what all IT systems are included in that line, and how would you respond to an event in that line? So this is where we're going to get into the fun. I know I say that all the time. These are those 16 sectors. I've shown you this before, so we're just going to jump right into this. Which two sectors are the most important to you? Do you monitor these other sectors? Do you have actively somebody on your team who's looking for any disruption to those sectors, anything that might impact you at all? Is somebody keeping an eye on how they're operating? Whether somebody's about to get bought out, whether somebody's getting ready to go bankrupt, is there civil unrest in any of those infrastructure sectors? How are you gathering information from those sectors? Would they alert you if they're having problems? Do you have lines of relationships or communications open? And then are you monitoring what type of threats exist to those particular industries? And then look at it from the other side. Which industries depend on you? And how are you looking at your own threats? And how are you communicating to your partners or the people that depend on you, hey, these are threats that we're worried about, just so you know we're doing fine, or we're looking at doing some disaster relief or disaster recovery here. How are you communicating downstream as well? But let's say that the news report indicates that there's an incident in somebody in your ecosystem, somebody in your supply chain. If it was reported that it's a data exfiltration, does that concern you? So somebody in your supply chain had all their data stolen. Well, does any of your data reside with their data? Do they have access to your data? Could your data have been stolen? Does that raise any red flags for you? What if they were just hit with ransomware? Does that impact you? Are you worried about them being able to meet your supply or your deadlines? Or are you worried about the quality of the stuff that they're giving you? What if it's an integrity attack? What if they're saying, hey, we think that they did something to our valves or to our systems. We're not certain if, the product that we produced is what is up to our quality control standards. Does that start to concern you? What types of attack against your supply chain start to raise flags within your own organization where you're starting to say, do we need to enact our own incident response plan based on something that had nothing to do directly with us? How are you communicating with your supply chain? What types of attacks interest you? And this is just a few of them. But let's say that the news reports incidents that somebody in your city got hit or somebody in your supply chain. If they had a network outage or a system outage, how long could you go without them before you start to have an impact? But then let's say that they told you, hey, we think that some of our accounts were compromised, and these are accounts that also have access to your network. Do you have a hunt team, or do you have capabilities to start looking at these things? How would you start to, once again, when do you raise awareness to upper management or to anybody that something's going wrong or that you need to start taking action? What happens if your own system, so none of your direct systems, but let's just say any systems you have pointed to the internet, like where customers can leave comments or they can make requests about the company, like, hey, can I get a point of contact for service XYZ? What if that system starts to get overrun because people are putting too much information into it? Almost like somebody is sniffing around trying to find a vulnerability in your data access systems or something like that. Do you have anybody in your organization who's actively looking at that? Would this start to raise flags? Would somebody in the IT department start to tell anybody in the OT side of the house, hey, we think we've got some probing going on here. You guys might want to start looking at your systems too. How much cooperation do you have between your teams internally at this point in time? So let's say that day 21, they begin a spear phishing campaign against you. They're targeting key organizational users, let's say in accounts payable, or let's move that around to the OT department. They're starting to hit people in key parts. I don't know what kind of company you run, but let's say key individuals. Would your IT shop or would your cybersecurity program be able to know that certain individuals are being targeted? Is there a reporting mechanism for people to say, hey, we think we have a problem here. This isn't just a phishing campaign, this is a targeted phishing campaign. And they're targeting very key individuals to our organization. Does that rise to any type of extra resources being used to analyze or look at this stuff? Let's say that you were getting ready to have a picnic or something, and somebody sent a phishing email to everybody with an attachment or link that had a bad URL on it or an open link on it or something. Do you have a way for somebody to report this? How far does your investigation go if it is reported? Do you look for anybody who's opened that attachment, or do you just try and clean it up from everybody's email box and hope that nobody clicked on it? How do you know when something's starting to go south? And at the same time, with everything we just talked about, how do you know whether you have one threat actor or multiple threat actors coming at you? Do you attribute this to a single set of events, or is this multiple people probing you? How do you start to raise the red flags within the organization? So let's start saying that now, on day 25, your help desk starts getting calls from everybody saying that, hey, my mouse is moving around on its own, random applications are opening, or there's network degradation. How would your help desk handle this? Does your help desk have a way to tell your IT or your OT security teams that, hey, we see something bigger is going on here, or are they just looking to get things back up and operational? Is there a disconnect between your help desk and your security team? How does this raise red flags in the organization? So let's say now that human resources receives an email, it's about a new hire, but they open the attachment and there's nothing in there, or they find that it's just a dead link or something like that. Do you have a way to look at this to see if there was malware in that attachment? Because guess what? It's accounts receivable and HR. Those are the two parts of your organizations that they pretty much have to open everything that comes into them. They open things up because they're expecting them to. Do you have a way to quarantine those particular people? Because they have access to a lot of data, but they also have a very public-facing part of their job description. What would happen if one of those people got hit in your organization? The victim notification that I did yesterday, it was pretty certain that it was their payroll people that got hit. What would you do? I'll tell a quick story here. One of the most recent incidents that we came across was a county that got hit with ransomware, or actually it wasn't ransomware. They got hit with a threat actor getting in and going into their payroll system, which was a cloud-based payroll system, but they got legitimate access, or they compromised an account internally, then used that to get to their payroll system. And they went into the payroll and they started shaving 10% off of every employee that made above a certain threshold, saying we just want 10% of their paycheck going into a different bank account. Because people above a certain pay threshold maybe don't look at their paychecks every week. But people below a certain pay threshold, depending on that money, they're looking at every penny. They might notice that they were shorted, a couple $100s or something. So they were just shaving off parts, and they were doing it across the entire organization. Tens of thousands of dollars every 2 weeks until somebody finally noticed. That's what the threat actors are starting to do. But then another company got hit. Their payroll system was hit with ransomware, and it was hit with ransomware it was hit on the day that they processed paychecks. How do you tell your employees that they're not going to get paid? Do you have an avenue to pay them if you don't have access to that system? How many of your employees would show up to work if they hadn't been paid? How do you build back the confidence of your employees if you didn't pay them on time? These are all questions that we think that need to be part of your incident response plan. So this one's always a fun one. I love doing this one when I was pen testing. Let's say that we used to leave them out in the parking lot, just drop USB thumb drives in the parking lot. We used to put on them company payroll, or we'd put down salary renegotiation strategies, and people would plug those in and we were in the network. How many of you would think if somebody was mailed a USB drive that people would plug it into their work laptop or their work computer? A lot of trusting people in here, right? I got to talk to Kevin Mitnick once. He told me that one of the funniest things that he ever did is they were tasked with getting into a company. And he was like, and this company knew that they were coming at him. And what he did is he went out and bought one of the latest and greatest gaming keyboards. And he opened up the keyboard, he changed the keyboard to the inside to have a keylogger on it, and then also to open a back door on any computer it was plugged into. He then repackaged this thing, put a shrink wrap back around it, and mailed it to the head of the IT department and said, hey, I'm with, company XYZ, the maker of the keyboard, and we thought that you might like to try out our new gaming keyboard and give us a recommendation. You can keep this for a month and then, we'll pay for shipping back to us, but just give us your thoughts and feedback. You think the guy plugged it into his work PC? Because that's where they shipped it to. He said not only did that guy plug it in, they let everybody in the IT department play with that keyboard for a whole day. They had every single account in that company. It's that easy sometimes. I'll tell you about the coffee maker story at some point too. So this is where the fun really gets going though, is let's say, and this is kind of what we were looking at with the one I did yesterday, is that there is a user. So let's say the Secret Service calls you or the FBI and says, hey, your information is on the dark web and it's for sale. Do any of you monitor the dark web for your company? For anything, the news about your company, anything like that? How would you know about this if we didn't come and tell you about it? What would you do if we did tell you about it? How would you validate that that's your data? Maybe it's just a screenshot of something. Maybe it's a sample file. How would you look to say, is that just publicly available data that somebody took from us? Is that company confidential data? Is this 5 days old? Is this 5 years old? How would you investigate that? And then you've had no indicators of compromise. How would you start to say, how did this data get out there? Do we have a threat actor in our networks? Do we have an insider threat sharing stuff with somebody? Where would you start your investigation? How would you start your investigation? That's key here. When would you contact law enforcement? When would you bring DHS, FBI, or local law enforcement in? How many of you have a good relationship with your local law enforcement? For some of you, you're saying, I've got plants all over the United States. Do I have to have a relationship with every local law enforcement? My answer to that is yes, you should. Because it's where the incident happens that the local law enforcement that has jurisdiction. If your headquarters is in Dallas, but your data center is in Houston, then it's the Houston. If it's a cyber incident, then Houston would have jurisdiction, not Dallas. Doesn't matter where your headquarters is, it matters where the data is. Now let's say your data is in the cloud. Now who has jurisdiction? Well, what if your cloud is in Taiwan? Or what if your cloud is in the Netherlands? That just really complicates things. So you start to see that the bigger your organization gets, the more complex from an architecture gets, the harder it gets to actually do a real investigation or to look at law enforcement. All right, so let's say that now the help desk is really getting swarmed because something's happened. We've gone from do you see that you have a problem to now you have a problem. You have extreme network speed degradation. Somebody is actively in the network, somebody's taking things down. They're having difficulty at accessing network resources. Your security tools aren't operating. Maybe even your domain controllers aren't doing their job properly. How is your IT and your cybersecurity team working together to rectify this? How is your OT team? Are they impacted? Do you have single sign-on? Is your single sign-on impacted? Would local access or local credentialing give you the amount of access you need in order to keep doing your job if your network access is down? Let's say that, HR, let's say that payroll systems being made to their account, the scenario I just gave you there. How would you start to look at payroll corrections? How would you know which payroll corrections to make? Think about this though from an OT's perspective. Let's say you start doing your manual reads on things and the computer's reading one level, manual reads are reading another level. What if somebody's been adjusting things from an IT or an OT perspective, but it's not the same in the manual read? How do you look at that? How would you identify something like that? Well, how does that fit into your incident response categories if manual versus automated is not syncing up? Let's say you're hit with ransomware now. Now, this is when the stuff hits the fan. So you're hit with ransomware. We'll call this one Ragnarok because it's the end of the world. Because let me tell you, every ransomware incident I've been on, it's been the end of the world for that company. The number of companies that I've seen almost go bankrupt, and I've seen a couple of them that have gone bankrupt. They limped along for a few months maybe, but it was catastrophic to them. How would you decide whether you're going to pay the ransom or not? Do you have a forum where your vendors and suppliers can aid you in making that decision? Are you listening to them when they're asking you? Are you looking at the impact you're having on your customers because you're not supplying them with something? Or are you looking at how you're communicating with your suppliers and vendors to say, hey, hold up on stuff. We can't take any more things coming in until we get things satisfied here. I mean, that's what Colonial Pipeline, that was the problem that they faced, is it was their IT systems got hit, but it was their health and safety system that was on the IT backbone that was one of the things that was hit. The other part was the pay, or how they acknowledge how much each individual would be charged for what was flowing through there. So they couldn't account for how much money they were going to lose if they kept the pipeline moving, and they also couldn't account for the safety of the pipeline, so they made the choice to shut it down. Who makes that decision in your organization? Who gets to decide whether something stays up or stays down? I always tell people that incident response, if nothing else in your plan, it needs to state when and how power shifts during a declared incident. And once again, I'll tell you another funny story, because there was an IT director once who realized that when he declared an incident, that he had a power shift and that he no longer had to follow the procurement process. So guess what? Every time anybody sneezed, he declared it an incident so he could buy whatever software he wanted without going through the procurement process. He had emergency powers. So he was abusing their incident response plan. And that's one of the things that you need to look at is, where does power shift during an incident? Who has the authority to talk to the press? Who has the authority to make decisions or to declare things or to go out and buy things or to hire people to come in and do things? Who gets to say when you enact your insurance claims? How does legal fit into the whole thing? I know you have some stories about legal. I can see that. Yeah, scars. So it's Colonial Pipelines. It was their legal department that actually kicked us out at DHS. I had a nice discussion with the master afterwards saying, hey, we were working great with you for a couple of days and then you just, kicked us to the curb. Why was that? And they said, Clint, the big thing here is that, you called us and you were great. The FBI, Chad Hunt, he called, he was great. But then we had the Department of Energy. We had the White House itself. We had the Coordinating Council. We had DHS proper. We had the Secret Service. We had the Transportation Security Administration. And the list just kept going on. He's like, we had every agency calling us, trying to get information or update that we'd already given to one agency. So that was on us. From the federal government, we need a better way of communicating with people so that we're not being part of the problem, because we were actually taking away their responders' ability to do their job because they had to keep answering our phone calls. So they finally just kicked us all to the curb and said, we'll talk to you after we're done with this. Which is why they were up on the Hill shortly after that, But that's the key, is how are you going to communicate with people? How are you going to let them know that you're doing an incident? How many of you ever heard Colonial Pipeline say that they had a cyber incident? They never said it. What did they say? They had a network outage, right? It wasn't until the president got online, on air and said that, hey, Colonial Pipeline has a cyber attack going on. That was the first time it was ever mentioned as a cyber attack, other than just some leaked news reports. But Colonial stuck with their guns and never called it a cyber attack. How is your organization prepared to say whether something's a cyber attack, a network outage, or an internal incident that's going on? What resources do you have to keep things? Are people trained to do that? So let's look. So let's say the local news starts to report that saying, hey, we've heard that company XYZ, your company, has had a ransomware incident, and they show a screenshot that could have only come from within your organization. What would you do in this case? You've told your people, you've trained your people never to talk to the press, but somebody obviously had. Would you investigate this while you're going through with the incident? Would you gather information on that as part of your investigation? Do you even have resources to take care of this while you're doing it? Because let me tell you, the number of small things that happen while you're dealing with an incident, they keep piling up. And if you keep sending one person to go take care of this or to gather evidence so we can, take remedial action against somebody later on, that's one person that's not responding to the incident. Another, I don't want to call this a funny story because these are always stories that I hate. We were doing an incident response with an organization once, and we were helping them trying to find patient zero. We were trying to find out how the bad guys originally got in. And we came across a folder that had child pornography in it on their network. What would you do if you came across somebody embezzling, or you came across somebody with child pornography, or somebody harassing another employee as part of your investigation into an event that you already have going on? Are you prepared for multiple events at the same time? How would you start to do, let's say it's something that you're going to need to prosecute or you need to bring law enforcement in. How are you prepared, if you haven't already brought law enforcement in, to bring law enforcement in, or would you try and just cover that up until after you're done dealing with this incident, then you would deal with the child pornography, knowing that you might be losing valuable data that would help you prosecute or put the person who did that behind bars? The first forensic investigation I ever did, I was working for a company up in Ohio, and we got a letter from Sony, and Sony said, we are suing you for violation of copyright for distribution of illegal MP3s and movies. And we said, we're a textile company. We don't do anything with that. So we immediately began an investigation. I went in, did forensics, and we did find that some threat actor got into one of our servers, set up his own share drive, and was distributing Sony's music library and Sony's movie library from our servers. So we helped law enforcement figure out who that person was. They went to those houses, but guess who still got sued for distribution of illegal materials? We did. Guess who lost that case? Actually, we settled, I suppose. But that's the thing is, what would you do if you find other evidence while you're dealing with something? Or have you even thought about what if the bad guys were distributing? What if the whole reason they broke into your network is to distribute child pornography or to hide or store child pornography? How would that make you feel if that gets out to the newspapers? You know, that's the thing that you have to look at. The other thing I want to talk about here is that last bullet point is, do you have an out-of-band communication method? If I want to call you, if I call you because I need to do a victim notification, if I think your network's been compromised, I'm not going to do it via email. I'm going to call you and I'm going to ask you for out-of-band communication to discuss something of dire importance with your organization. Are you prepared for that? For those of you who are regulated, do you have a way that, because all that would still need to be part of your company records, as this is how the investigator started. Are you prepared to, if you're using your personal account, for that to become part of company records? You know, or to be brought up in a court of law, that sort of thing. So think about out-of-band communication. Does your organization have a way to communicate with people if you think your network's been compromised? I'll tell you that the number of organizations I go into to respond to a ransomware event where we say, do you have a network diagram? Do you have an incident response plan? They say, yes, it's on our network. And say, okay, can we have a copy? And they say, no, because we have ransomware and it's all been encrypted. The only copy of their plan and the only copy of their diagrams and stuff are all online. Do you have another place where you store those things so you can get to them in a time of crisis if you don't have access to your network? If your IT department sits in one geographic location and your site's in another and it gets hit with ransomware and they can't log in remotely, how are you going to get your team there to deal with the issue? Do you have people on site that can do it? How much time is going to pass before you're going to have somebody capable of getting on site? Are the people who are on site, are they just general operators who can do some of the basics, but they don't understand chain of custody or forensic, footprinting and things like that? How are you actively looking at how you're going to administer cybersecurity in a time of crisis? Let's see. All right, I feel like I've been talking forever already. Let's talk about how you've solved the incident. You come out clean on the other side, or as clean as you can anyway. How many of you do an after-action report? How many of you go back and say, what did we do well, what didn't we do well? How do you build that continuous loop of, did our program go the way that it was supposed to? I see a lot of people already looking down at the table going, oh my God, this is too much. When the city of Atlanta got hit, I had the joy of being there with them through almost everything that happened to them. I had to talk. So the Super Bowl was getting ready to come to Atlanta, so we were already working with Atlanta on prepping for the Super Bowl. And the city of Atlanta CISO, and he was telling me that he kept touting how great of an IT team he had and how these people were just the best of the best. And he was really lucky to have it as state salary to be able to have this team. After the incident, he looked at me and he said, Clint, I know I told you my team was here. He goes, but my team is here for steady state operations. For crisis operations, my team was here. He's like, my team knows how to keep a router up and running, but they don't know how to configure it on the fly. They can't quarantine. They don't know how to make changes. They can't build databases quickly. They're steady state operators. Incident response is a completely different skill set. People don't understand that. You have to have people who can, get you through a time of crisis, who don't crack under pressure. They need to be able to work fast. I'll tell you a couple other funny stories here. Do I have time? Yeah, I got a little bit of time. So when I was with the intelligence community, we were in Dayton, Ohio, and our incident crisis team was 14 members that in a time of crisis, we would redeploy to Washington, D.C. to stand up our alternate servers as quickly as possible. Tornadoes hit Dayton, Ohio, causing massive outages. The crisis team was enacted. Those 14 members all showed up to the airport. We all flew over. We all got everything stood up, right? 3 members showed up. The other 11 people said, how can I leave my family in a time of crisis? They've got no power, they've got no water, I just had a baby, my mother-in-law is sick, I can't go. 3 people to do 14 people's job. That's what we had. Have you actually looked at your incident response plan and what you're asking people to do? Whether you're asking them to walk away from their families and things like that. This is what you need to, so after action reports, you need to say what worked well. Oh, Bob was on vacation, we didn't respond as well because Bob really knows everything. You know, the bad guys know all these things. They're looking at you, they're gonna hit you when you're down. And guess what? It's always at the worst possible time. It's gonna be when everybody's on vacation or it's the 4th of July weekend. I always like to say in the intelligence community, we never got holidays off because the bad guys always hit us on every holiday. I spent 4th of July in a sock. I spent Christmas in the sock. I spent, Thanksgiving in the sock because that's when they were coming after us because they knew nobody else was on post. So that's what we had to look at, and I'm sure they're doing the same things to you. They're hitting you when your people are away, when your eyes are diverted somewhere else, when there's another crisis going on. How would you validate the systems as you bring them online? How do you know that nobody made changes to them while they were down or while you were in times of crisis, when you're restoring them from backups? Or do you have some set of things to look at to say, is this right? Are you bringing your security tools up at the same time you're bringing your operational team up? This is the thing that we see most often is most organizations have a very large IT or OT group. They have a very small security OT or security IT group. So the IT group or the OT groups are able to get their systems back up really fast. And the security team, though, doesn't have their tools ready to go back up yet, and yet they bring the other systems online just to get business continuity going. But there's no security around them. So guess what? When I said those other threat actors are coming in, that's when you see those other overlaying, infections happening or those advanced persistent threats getting in there. It's because you're bringing your tools up too fast and not in line with your security stack. And how do you determine when an incident is closed? Do you close it when you're back to normal operations or at least back to semi-normal operations? Or do you close it when you've checked off the box that you found patient 0, you know that the network is clean, and you've made all the remedial efforts that you need, putting all the new systems in line that you need to keep it from happening again? When do you close out your ticket? When do you say the incident is really over? And how do you address reputation after the event? How do you build back customer confidence? How do you build back employee confidence? How do you build back stakeholder confidence, shareholder confidence, or even your C-suite's confidence in your cybersecurity program, in your company as a whole? How do you deal with all of that? How much time and effort does that take? Because that's not an overnight thing. You have to look at incident response as more than just the technical aspect of the program. It's everything coming together. So I think that's all I have for right now. We're going to take some questions here, I think. Hopefully I didn't scare you guys. Did I scare anybody too much? All right. I'll try harder next time then.
I wanted to start with a question about monitoring and evaluating supply chain partners, right? That's something that we've talked a lot about. I think you talked about it too, Ricky. Can you give anybody here advice on where end users can go on how to monitor and evaluate their supply chain partners and what kind of benchmarks, should we be using? I think people are real familiar with how to evaluate their own organizations, but when it comes to third parties, I think that's kind of a gray area. So can you offer us any words of wisdom on that?
Sure. So we do a few things. So number one, from a procurement perspective, we have invested a significant amount of effort making sure that our terms and conditions, our master service agreements, all those things with our suppliers meet our internal standards. And frankly, it makes some suppliers not want to work with us because we're very stringent about it. So we do it from that perspective, but then also something that Clint brought up about do you monitor intelligence that can give you indicators that some of your suppliers may be compromised? We have various threat intelligence subscriptions that we look at as well. So we manage it from a procurement perspective. We make sure that before we go into anything from a supplier standpoint, they have attestation to our standards of doing business with us. And then from a cybersecurity perspective, we monitor various threat intelligence subscriptions.
Okay. Clint?
That answer, check. That answer is going to make me tear up a little bit. That was great, thank you. Yeah, we see too many times organizations, we ask, so it's external dependency management assessment that we do. We're looking into how exactly do you enter contracts with organizations? How do you build relationships with them? And the thing that we get most is most places, they say, oh, we went to our vendors and they handed us a contract, we signed it. And we look at them and say, well, did you change the contract? Did you put your security resilience requirements into the contract? Did you put your recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives? Did you put your expectations in there? And they're like, well, no, they just told us that we couldn't modify the contract, especially when it comes to cloud services. And we're like, well, then they're covering their butt, but are you covering yours? Because you need to put what you expect out of them, and you need to hold them to that. Too many people sign a contract and then they never monitor against it. They're never looking at, are people actually meeting our needs? We had a courthouse once, and we were doing the EDM with them, and I was asking them, have you ever had one of your vendors, miss their, SLA? And he said, oh, we have one of our critical vendors, they have an SLA of 24 hours, and they missed it once. I said, oh, okay, do you mind telling me what time, when that was? And he just gave me the story about how they missed it, during a power outage. Well, the person sitting next to him said, oh, hey, I agree, but it was actually this time. And the person sitting next to him said, no, it was this time. And they went around the room where the vendor had figured out that if they called somebody different in the office every single time they missed their SLA, there was no centralized repository for reporting that they had missed the SLA, that each person in that office thought they'd only missed it once, when in the end they'd missed it 14 times in the last year. And that contract was up for renewal. How are you monitoring against your own resilience requirements? The city of Orlando, and I know Rosa would probably get mad at me, but Rosa is the CISO for the city of Orlando. And I was once, when the first time I ever got to meet her, I was going in there and she had a vendor in there. She's like, oh, Clint, just hold up a minute. She's like, I just need to finish discussion with the vendor. And she looked at this major vendor and she said, here are my security requirements. And he goes, yeah, we can't put those in the contracts. And then she said, okay, thank you, get the F out of my office. And he looked at her and said, well, but we're the largest vendor that does this. She's like, I don't care, if you're not willing to meet my requirements, then I'm not gonna do business with you. We have to speak with our pocketbooks, and if you're not willing to hold vendors accountable to what you need, not what they want to give you, then they're gonna continue to work their way. Even if you're a small company, you have rights, you have the ability to say, this is what I want in the contract. Yes, there might increase the price on you because you're getting more out of that, but that's what the business decision you have to make is, am I willing to pay for more security, or do I want what they're willing to give me? You have to change the contract.
That's great advice. Put that language into the SLA and hold them accountable. I'm all for that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Just tell us who you are and where you're from, if you don't mind.
Sure. Hi, Dave Hake from Armis. I actually have a question for each of you, but I'll go to Ricky first, if that's okay. First of all, I love your twist of phrase to digital collaboration, because IT/OT convergence is a thing. It's just not a business process or a department. It's a phenomenon. And how you manage it is collaboration. And just in your two talks between you, you mentioned, suppliers, SIs, tech stack, suppliers, B2B customers, EHS, reliability, ESG, finance, legal, risk management, divisions, regions, procurement. It's not like your department solves cyber for ExxonMobil. But my question is simply this: ExxonMobil's not a thing, like you had a chart that says OT and the business. It's 12 big businesses. It's in fact the biggest business in the whole world. How do you prioritize which business, which problem, which site, which region? I mean, how do you get up in the morning and say what's important?
So that's a very great question. So the way that we govern all that prioritization is we have created a very, what can be sometimes complex series of governance committees where each business line has representation, our engineering functions have representation, and our IT functions have representation. And it can be a challenge sometimes because just like everybody else, we have finite resources, whether those resources are people, dollars, whatever the case may be. So it can be a challenging process to prioritize where we want to spend our efforts. From a cybersecurity perspective, our approach is always from a risk-based standpoint. Where are the highest consequences events that we are trying to mitigate? Let's focus our efforts there first. So there are some business lines which have lower consequence events that could be associated from a cyber incident. We want to make sure that we're capturing the mitigations for the higher consequences events. So a very risk-based approach, but still with the appropriate cross-functional representation from each of our business units, our engineering functions, and our IT department. So if you saw the governance charts, it would look quite complicated, but we need to make sure that each of those functions has a voice, has the appropriate representation, so that at the end of a prioritization effort, everybody owns the outcome. And so some business lines may not get the same amount of attention as other ones, given those high consequence events that we're focused on. But that doesn't mean that we won't address those lower consequence events eventually. We just need to focus on the higher consequence events first.
Thank you. And that's exactly what I hoped you'd say. And Clint, ExxonMobil represents what, 2 or 3 maybe of the 16 categories, and the 16 categories that you manage in your program is 1,000 SIC codes and 10,000 or more just in the Southeast companies. How do you prioritize what you care about of the 16 C&I segments, and how do you get up in the morning except to look at your email and phone and say how you're going to save the world?
Well, if you looked at my email, you would see that I have 22,000 unread emails, and that's just scratching the surface. I always tell people, you really need to get a hold of me. A phone call is going to be the best way, because between my travel and always being with partners and stuff like that, getting to email is not the thing that I do best. But that's why the program that we're building, so we have national level programs. So headquarters looks at things from a national perspective. But we've regionalized over the last 5 years, so we have regional offices in all 10 regions throughout the United States, and they're looking at things from a regional perspective. So, and then we have state coordinators in every state, and they're looking at things from a state level. And then our next level is to put people near large concentrations of critical infrastructure. When we first built this program, they wanted all the cybersecurity advisors to be in DC, and they would just fly out to whoever needed us to help them. We said, no, we want to live in the communities that we support. We want to be part of that culture. We don't want to have headquarters. We don't want DC to tell us what's important. We want the communities to tell us what's important. And that's where we are right now, is we're building relationships in those communities to say, where are the things that are important? But that's also a double-edged sword, because when we go to like a county and we say, what are the most important things in the county? The first thing the county tells us is that the county fairgrounds is the most important thing we have in the county, because that's how we generate all of our revenue. And meanwhile, they have a meat processing plant that generates 1/4 of all the chicken in the entire United States right down the road that gets hit with a cyber attack, and suddenly, chicken prices almost double. Which one should we have been paying more attention to? Well, it wasn't the county fairgrounds, it was that, chicken packing plant or whatever. So that's the struggles that we're finding, but we're finding, good partners to do it with. We partner up with, we call them Section 9 companies, and those are the too large to fail. Those are things that are outlined by the National Defense Team to say these organizations need to be the focus of our efforts in cybersecurity or in physical security even. And then we work with them to say, okay, who are your supply chain? And then they start working with us, showing who they rely upon. And then we start going out in the communities. We talk to each state saying, who do you rely on? Then we talk to those things. And so we're building this network, this spider web of what's actually, as I talked about in my previous thing, that cascading effect. What one pin could I pull that causes all the dominoes to fall down? And that's what we're looking for. But we're still in the infancy of that, and that's the relationships we're trying to build.
Great answers and a great question. I think we have one more question here. Yes, sir.
Hi, Oren from OpSWAT. First of all, Ricky and Clint, thank you very much for the insights. I wanted to comment on one thing and ask a question, especially towards Clint. So first of all, I completely agree with the notion you said of how to communicate when you experience an incident. You gave one example, I think a fantastic example, maybe not because of the incident, but with how Norsk Hydro communicated around their event. They were extremely transparent. I think that provides a lot of trust to their stakeholders. I think the incident wasn't coincidental. First, they have a new CEO. The other one is about communications, and I see this where I sit. Be friendly to white hackers, right? So if someone reports a vulnerability, treat them nicely, right? They're doing your job and probably seeing something that an external threat actor would also see. The question is, and you talked about recovering from ransomware. So we talked about briefly pay or not to pay, but what I'm seeing is an increasing notion of bringing in external people to help negotiate and resolve the incident. What do you think about that? I mean, there are some that say the actors will see you brought somebody from the outside, not great. The other one is don't try to reinvent the wheel when you're dealing with these people. So I'll be glad for insights on that.
Certainly. So with ransomware is always tricky. And for the federal government perspective, we're always going to ask that you please don't pay. But we also understand that it's a business decision you have to make. You know, I've given some examples over the last couple of days about if you're a hospital, you have people on life support and the life support system that gets hit, you know, or you don't have access and you really need that data. It's a decision you're going to have to make, and it's a decision you'd want to make ahead of time. But I always tell you the bad guys are always going to find that one situation in which it's going to make you rethink what you thought you were going to say. Before I get into my full answer, I want to give you just a quick analogy. Is when I first came into the intelligence community, I had to go and do a interview with a person, and we'll just leave it at that. And this person sat down, and one of the first questions he looked at me, he was like, I'm only going to ask you one question as part of your vetting through this security process is, would you ever give national secrets to a foreign agent? And of course, you know, me being, 21 years old and cocky, I'm like, no. And he's like, I'm going to ask you again, and I want a real answer. Would you ever give national secrets to a foreign agent? Once again, I'm looking at him like, a little less sure. I'm like, no. He's like, so if I had a gun to your wife's head, I was like, whoa, now you're playing around. He's like, what about if I had your kids? He's like, I need to know what your breaking point is. Everybody has a breaking point. Everybody has a point in which they will make a decision they didn't think they would ever make. And that translates to your company. You have a time or crisis where you're going to make a decision that you hadn't planned for. But the more that you plan, the more that you exercise, you'll be better able to make that decision or see that decision coming when you need to. So that being said, what we've seen is that most insurance companies, for people who have cyber insurance, if you look at it from their perspective, they're trying to make money. The cheapest way for them to make money is to negotiate down the ransom and pay the ransom rather than paying your incident response costs, because the cost of responding to an incident, forensics, cleaning it up, getting you back up and operational is huge. Where paying the ransom negates their obligation, like we paid your ransom, gave you the decryption key, now it's on you. And so that's the problem that we're seeing, is that the insurance community is perpetuating the problem because their first objective is to pay the ransom. Unless your company has it spelled out in your policy that, hey, we want to do everything in our power to not pay the ransom first and then execute down. If that's our last ditch option, then that's where we're going to do it. If you leave it to them to make the decision, the insurance company will always pay the ransom first because that's how they get out of it the quickest with the least amount of money, especially since they're usually able to negotiate the price down quite a bit. But that problem with that is that we see more people get in the ransomware market, and it just keeps building it up more and more.
Yeah, I read an interview with a Russian ransomware operative, and he said that he always goes after companies that have cyber insurance because he knows they're going to get paid. That's their preferential target. Do we have another question in the audience here? Okay.
Hi, John Cusimano with Deloitte. Thank you both for your presentations. My question has to do with assessments. So kind of core to any cybersecurity program, particularly ICS cybersecurity program, is assessments. The challenge I'm seeing, I've been in this industry for a long time, is that not every company, but there's a lot of different definitions of what is a good assessment from both the suppliers and from the asset owners and the standards bodies. So there's gap assessments, there's maturity assessments, there's compliance assessments, there's vulnerability assessments, there's pen tests, there's risk assessments that actually look at threats and vulnerabilities and rank risks. My question to either one of you or both of you is, in your experience, since I think that they kind of all have their place, but I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of what assessments do you find to be the most valuable, and in what and which assessments are right for where you are kind of in your life cycle, or which one's the right type of assessment for the application, I guess.
So I'd say the best assessment for you is anything that's going to generate an actual action item. The problem I find with most organizations when they bring an assessment team is they're either looking for regulatory compliance, which means that they're actually trying to hide where they're vulnerable or where they have issues, or they're trying to, the security team's doing it to show upper management how awesome their security team is, so they're using it to, With the assessments that we do, the cyber resilience review assessment that we do, I tell people that it's one of my favorite assessments out there because most organizations I go into, they're all smiling at me and they're all happy until I get about 20 questions in, and then they're looking at me and I say, I'm sorry, I'm about to show you your baby's ugly. Because that's what the assessment does. It shows you that everybody has limited resources. Where are your resources deployed? People tend to gravitate toward what they do well. So if you do a lot of incident response, then you have a great incident response team. But if you had a good asset management team or a good change management team, then you wouldn't need incident response teams. There are 10 domains of cybersecurity. Each domain should be assessed independent of all the other domains, and then they should be assessed together. However you want to do it, but you need to baseline and you need to say, where are my levels of acceptable risk? And then you need to say, how mature am I and what maturity fits for me? Because you're never going to get all the people you want. You're never going to get all the money you want. So maybe operating at a level 2 incident response is okay for you as long as you're operating at a level 5 asset management. It just really depends on the organization and what you're looking to do. But if it's not actionable, if there's not some action item that comes out of the assessment, then it's just a waste of your time. Because nobody needs a picture of how good they look because we all know that you don't look good. The last thing I'll say on that is that it's all about resilience. And I always like to tell people that resilience is a lot like being healthy. Everybody in here wants to be healthy, right? Where can I go to buy health? Is there any place I can buy health? No. If you go to your doctor and you're feeling terrible, and the doctor says, okay, what am I seeing you for today? How do you feel? And you say, I feel great, there's nothing wrong with me. He's gonna be like, okay, great, we'll see you in 6 months, and you're out the door. Meanwhile, you still feel sick. If you lie to your assessments, the assessments are gonna lie right back to you. And that's the truth of the matter. You need an assessment where nobody's being held accountable for what comes out of it, but gives you a picture of how you really operate. That's the best assessment, where it's non-attribution, but you can really see how you operate.
Yeah, I totally agree. The assessment should generate action items. I'll give some examples of what we do at ExxonMobil. So first of all, foundationally, we do risk assessments based upon our own internal standards that are mapped to 62443 in the NIST cybersecurity framework for the majority of the business lines. So that's a periodic activity, and there's also a threat vector assessment that's incorporated into that. So we're not only looking at risk, but all the various threat vectors as well. That gives us an understanding of where we need to mitigate various elements of risk. And this takes place at the asset level, every business line globally. Another assessment that we do that I believe is very valuable is we have an internal red team that goes in very coordinated with the asset to align on timing, scope, et cetera, because these are production facilities. And we do red team assessments, which generates a lot of things that most people didn't really know about. All of those items that are identified may not necessarily be remediated, but they are cataloged because, again, we are in the business of managing risk. So there may be some vulnerabilities that we think are low consequences relative to the risk assessments that we do that identifies our high consequence events. But I do believe those red team assessments are extremely valuable. From an external perspective, periodically we do a maturity assessment against standards, and we bring in an independent third party to partner with us on that. To be honest, sometimes those aren't as valuable because depending on the partner that we choose, they may just tell us that we're great at everything versus telling us where we need to focus. So it's really dependent upon that partner. We've had some really great ones and some not so great ones. We were also recently just audited by our friends in the federal government from a pipeline perspective, if you know where I'm going with that. So I think, John, it's, from my perspective, foundationally, the risk assessments, understanding our threat vectors, leveraging internal capabilities like our red teams to identify where we have vulnerabilities, leveraging trusted third parties to also augment our assessment capabilities to give us that outside-in perspective. I see value in all of them. And again, we have to prioritize which ones we do and prioritize the outcome of those because we can't fix everything at the same time.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Eric DeVoy with BP. Enjoyed both presentations, so thanks for that. Ricky, you talked a bit about the good work that you were doing to secure third parties into your OT environments, and then Clint, you talked about the bad guys' approach to island hop. At BP, we have a concept we call digital distancing because we work with a lot of third parties, a lot of vendors, and I guess I'm always looking for best practice thoughts on how to be better at distancing ourselves from our providers and third parties when they are compromised, because they do get compromised, and it's an area we're looking to improve. So, any thoughts on that?
I like the term digital distancing. If it was up to me, we would not have any external network connections coming into our ICS environments at all, because that introduces a threat vector. If a third party needed data, we would publish that data somewhere very far away from an ICS environment so they could securely go subscribe to it as needed. So, but if we were working with a third party that had some level of connectivity into our environment, going back to my comment around our threat intelligence feeds that we monitor, ideally the third party would inform us immediately. However, we would also monitor those threat intelligence feeds for indicators of compromise with the third parties that we work with. And one of the reasons that we went to that architecture that I was highlighting from an external network connection perspective, now that those network control points are managed and monitored centrally, if we did get an indicator that a supplier that had connectivity via one of those network control points was compromised or at risk of being compromised, we could sever that connection centrally. Historically, we would have to depend on the site to physically go out there and do a disconnect. We still may have them do a physical disconnect at the site, but from a logical perspective, we can do that immediately when we get notified. So I love the term digital distancing. We're trying to create what we coined at one point in time a digital perimeter that we can manage and control, disconnect whenever we need to, always using a physical disconnect as a further measure, but it's the same concept. We want to enable the business value and minimize the threat vectors that value enablement provides. So again, if they only need data, and I have a mechanism to provide that data where they don't have to come into our environment, that's going to be our first option. That architecture that I highlighted is only for those use cases where they need that physical connection into our ICS environments. Then we deploy that kit so we can manage, monitor, and disconnect as needed.
I agree with everything he just said. You need a business requirement for every connection, whether those are internal connections, but mostly for your third party and external connections. What do they need? How often do they need it? How are you going to provide that? What controls do you have around it? And the problem I see with a lot of organizations is you might have an insider threat program or a DLP program, but it's focused on just everybody that works at the company. You need to have a separate, part of your DLP needs to be, how are you specifically monitoring third parties and what they're doing? How do you know whether they're abusing their access, whether they're sharing accounts, What happens if somebody on one of those third parties is disgruntled with the company that they work for and they want to really show them by making them lose their biggest contract, which is with you? And so they're going to use their connection to do something bad. You don't know how the other companies treat their employees. You don't know anything about them, yet you have to give them accounts in order to do the job the business requirement that goes through there. You're taking a lot of trust with any third party. And some of that you can cover under contract. Some of it you just have to do a lot of monitoring. And I know that everything I say there, that you're like, well, that's dollars and stuff like that. Yeah, but somebody's got to look at that and assess the risk. But, if you don't need the connection, if they only need it for one day out of the month, then only enable it one day out of the month. Don't keep it on there all the time. You set your limits. The business requirement will give you your standards on what you need, how often you need it, and make them really give you the real business requirement. Not just that they need connection. Give them what ports, protocol, services, exactly what data, and then monitor against that to make sure that's the only thing actually happening. That's probably the best thing that you can do right there. And then build a relationship. Have relationship managers assigned to each third-party contract to keep validating that business requirement, to keep validating what their cybersecurity. Audit and assess your third parties, saying, hey, are you a SOC 2 Type 2 data center? I need that certificate every year, not just the first year I went to contract with you. Every year I need to see that certificate. I need you to send me your latest vulnerability scans showing me how vulnerable you are. I need you to show me that you did a cyber exercise this last year. Hold people accountable for the programs if they're going to connect to you. write that into your SLA, your contract, is they have to be part of your cybersecurity program.
Thanks, Clint. Do we have any other audience questions? Clint, you mentioned earlier that Flint should strive to develop better relationships with local law enforcement. Do you have any advice on how to do that? It's a good idea, but I was just thinking if I was a plant manager, how would I go about doing that? You just call the police department, or I mean, how do you do that?
Yep. Every police department I've met, every FBI agent I've met, they absolutely love it when you call them when you don't need them. They love to hear from their customers, from their partners, from people in their jurisdiction, that they just want you to come out. I mean, think about it. Think about your fire department. You know, do you have comm closets that you don't want them just to run in even if there's a small fire and just start spraying water everywhere? Are there certain places they're supposed to avoid? You know, if you invite them in every 6 months or so to say, hey, I want to walk you through our environment to show you what areas I have computers, so you're not going to use water in those areas unless it's absolutely necessary. You know, I want to show you the buildings I have that have 24/7 operations so that you know that you need to evacuate those buildings before you start trying to fight the fire in those buildings. You know, local law enforcement is the same way. Bring them in saying, hey, what are your cyber capabilities? Could you help us during a time of crisis? And they might look at you and be like, hey, we have no forensics investigators. We have no real capabilities around that. Well, at least now you know that they don't. I mean, from a physical security standpoint, your physical team probably already has a relationship with them. We talk to people all the time, and somebody must have done some risk evaluation. How many of you have security guards for your organization, whether in-house or third party? Why aren't you relying on local law enforcement to be your security guards? Well, because they have other things to do. And somebody drew the line in the sand saying, hey, this is where our relationship with them will start and will end. We'll have to have our own to cover us. You need to do the same thing from a forensic standpoint. Hey, local law enforcement, what are you capable of doing? What do we need to do in-house? What do we need to have maybe talk to CISA or FBI? Because you would be surprised at what the FBI can do for you on a recurring basis without you ever declaring a crisis. They can be some people that, if you want them to come into your facility and give you a briefing once a month on what the current threats are, they'll probably do it. If you need us to give you security clearances so that we can talk to you at a higher level, we can issue you security clearances for certain members of your staff. However you want to talk to us, we can't build our programs to what you need if you're not telling us what you need. Invite us in to exercise with you. Invite us in to just do walkthroughs with you. Invite us to be part of your change management board when we can attend. I mean, we can't always be there, but we like to do it when we are able to, because we want to know how you operate. And that's one of the pilot programs I'm working on right now. Is actually I'm working with FedEx as one of the main people. We're trying to build a relationship management program. Is how does the federal government, not just CISA, but how does the federal government establish and build a relationship across all our different agencies with a company, and then how do we sustain that, and then how do we exercise that relationship, and how do we keep adding value to the people who need us or rely upon us, and then how do we trickle that down to their supply chains so that we're not just protecting the big people, but we're protecting everybody all at once.
Yeah, go ahead, Ricky, please.
Yeah, just having myself been in a manufacturing facility for a number of years, it is a privilege to be able to operate within the communities where our plants reside. And it is incumbent upon leadership at those facilities to have the right relationships with the community stakeholders, whether that be fire, police, or what have you. So it's just something that I know within my company, we take that very seriously, and we do appreciate all the relationships that we have with the local municipality, our community stakeholders, fire department, et cetera. So just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, that's good advice. Thanks. I do have one more question for you too, Ricky. So you mentioned earlier about stranded data, right? And you wanted to do secure wireless monitoring of equipment in the plant environment. Can you give us a few pointers on how you got that done, or how to do that, or
Sure.
pitfalls to avoid, anything?
Many pitfalls. So we saw a significant proliferation of third parties approaching our facilities directly, trying to sell them services. And some people refer to them as industrial Internet of Things, right? Low-cost sensors that connect to a gateway that's provided by the third party, and it sends the data off to the third party cloud so the business can go look at it whenever they want. So that was a problem that we had to solve, because we didn't want a multiplicity of these sensors showing up in the plants. These service providers have relationships with the facilities. They would show up. Sometimes they would give them free sensors to trial. Things would just pop up in the facility. We wanted a way to control that connectivity, especially if any of the sensors had a connection into an ExxonMobil network, which some of them did. So we started to put in some policies in educating the sites to say we want to enable this type of connectivity, but you have to do it through these mechanisms, through our network control point, so we manage the flow and the security of that data. The other item, which I may talk about at another forum, is making sure that we retain sovereignty or ownership of some of those data elements. While the site may not think it's very important that our time series data on a reciprocal compressor is flowing to a third party to do analytics on, we may want that same time series data in our data lake so that we can do broader analytics from an event correlation perspective in alignment with all the other process data surrounding that rotating equipment. So we looked at it from two perspectives: security and then data integrity and data security. So I would say if anybody is challenged with this is a subject which I can speak on for many, many hours. Come catch me after the conference. The one thing I would ask you to take away is make sure you look at both of those elements. The security of the connectivity that's being introduced into your facility. Do you need to manage and control that? And the other one is the data ownership. Is that data important to you for future use cases, which may be broader than what that individual site is looking at?
Excellent points. Well, we are at the end of our program. You heard Ricky. If you see him later, catch him and ask him any questions you want about what we were talking about here. I think Clint has to take off after this, but really appreciate both you guys coming. Great presentations and great engagement in answering the questions. And thank you guys for asking so many questions. So let's give a big hand for our presenters. And hopefully we'll see you in here in the next session at 4 p.m. Thanks, everybody.